So these must be active. This will want to not, well, maybe yours is fine. You want not to move your computer too much because I noticed it the other day. That's not, yeah, that's not doing anything. That's what I guess. Just thought it was up there. See if that does it. I'll start the presentation. Would you like it just with the biggest picture? I don't
I don't mean to interrupt, I'm just curious, so I get to talk later, and I can just use my laptop.
Yep.
And through the HDMI.
Yep. Or if you need to. Yes. We have options, but it usually goes through HDMI. Yeah, right now. So
I may test it maybe on later break.
that'd be a good idea.
I got a video to show the sound.
Give it a try.
Okay.
Even after the teacher complains, days when you come in, it's like,
What's going on today?
so I was thinking before and after, probably checking. That's about the smallest. Donna has this. Yeah. Should be in my mailbox.
Do you have the abstract for this?
I do not. I haven't seen it.
I think it's always interesting to hear about on the ground. Maybe we don't share it up sometimes. I think it's yeah.
It's really neat to see the differences between secular and Christian university. It's really easy.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. This is something I always wanted to look at. Now some people want to take a look at it.
Yeah, we'll see what's on the table
Just graduated. You know, I have a job at the start, so I've been working with the physics department this summer.
You have it figured out?
Yes,
Is
it's
that too
running.
hard?
No.
Once it gets set up, it's really simple. It's just sometimes it doesn't quite work right until you get the settings right.
Yeah.
So specifically,
Brendan said he got all the kinks out, so I just had to push play. So I was using it.
Yep. Yep. No, I looked at the video last night from the keynote and it was good. You could certainly hear it. And,
But I'm actually
a couple of people were watching, so. I don't know if anybody was watching this morning. There was probably more to get the video this morning. I didn't figure, but there might be a couple more this afternoon, just since this is a little bit more related to the industry. So a few of the ones, I don't know. Either way, it's nice to have videos while I'm turning, so.
It's really funny because I'm a mechanical engineer and electrical engineering is kind of my thing, and optics is really cool. This is my area of optics.
This sounds ready to mess.
Last summer. And so I'm into electrical optics. And my actual job title is electronics engineer. It's just like makes me cringe a little every time I see it.
Playing with my best friend, he sent me a photo of the statue.
You don't think it's going to get 2 hours of
Toast 2.0.
Yeah.
No comment.
Chairs. Yes. You, what's that? CC for the Sioux City. Oh, for this
check the list.
said it's no, but no, I'm asking Session 3 looks like that's all starting. So if you want to moderate those. Thanks for clarifying.
I mean, and we all the time, but so that's kind of the route that.
I think I got everything.
No, he's gone with that whole
Well, welcome everyone. The ethics hour. You have announcements, Justin?
The only announcement I was going to make is just for those of you who did the Friday only registration, I just wanted to make sure you know that the coffee out there is very much available for you too. Like if you're wondering if you're a CEC registrant or not, you are. Everyone here is, so help yourself to those snacks and the coffee out that are on the table there.
I mean, this is going to be so dynamic, you won't need coffee.
Thank you for that build-up.
I think George was going to
Oh, yeah.
So
No pressure.
Well, welcome. It's good to have everybody here. Actually, what I want to do right now, because I'm going to give you a heads up, we might have you get up in a little bit. How many of you are joining us from industry this afternoon? Okay, see those hands? There tends to be clusters here. I'm just going to warn you, we need your expertise mixed into these. How many are you from educational institutions, graduate school, academics? Okay, see those hands? So there's a little bit of cluster in here. We're going to have some people get up because we need to have expertise from both sides talking to each other in a little bit, because part of this is conversation. We're actually taking advantage of you and your expertises, if that's a way of saying that.
Works for me.
And this is an experiment for us. It's the first time we are doing this, but we knew that there was a need in the community. We knew we had talked and taught some of this stuff over the years. With a PE license myself, I've been to many different PDH courses over the years, and they vary in style and value and information overload and all sorts of different things. So we thought, well, let's give it a try as well. And particularly, I know in Iowa, with the requirement of an ethics PDH requirement, we thought, well, that fits well with this conference. Let's try it. So that's the background of what we're doing here. I hope it's valuable for everyone here, whether you're coming from industry or you are regular attenders of CEC. So
We're going to need to use most of the chairs, so there are chairs available, so if you want to, you can come and fill them. Or if you see people coming in late, you can direct them to the empty chairs as well.
So remember your hands raised. I'm going to ask about 120. We're going to break into a little discussion, and I hope we can just mix up them as well a little bit. So, before we get too far, I would like to send around a sign-up sheet. Just pass it through the tables. For those of you who would like to get PDH hours and to have a certificate that you have in your file for your records, we'll get that to you. Just put your name on here and how many PDH hours you would like. The reason it could be, I mean, you just can't pick a number.
Well, you can.
If I see 30 on there,
What's happening?
I'll let your conscience decide. If you happen to be staying for more presentations, Iowa, I've been in Iowa too, they do allow more liberal arts PDHs, and for those who are staying on to listen to more presentations but like to be part of that, you can use that as well. So that's the varying amount of PDHs depending on what your schedule is today. Okay, does that make sense? So that way, just write that down. If you're here for the 2-hour session, put 2 PDHs, and we'll make sure you get a certificate. So
Most of the attendees, if you registered earlier, will be on the sign-up sheet. Your name will be there. Just fill in the box. But there is a place, if you're not showing up on that sheet, you can sign your name as well. So add your name.
So I'll start this around this way.
And I think as far as the numbers go, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you were going to stay for the afternoon session up until the free time, that'd be 3 hours worth of material. I think you're comfortable with that. And if you're going to do the evening session, also stay for dinner in the evening session, I think that would be 5, right? Is that what we thought it would land?
2, 3, and 5.
Those are probably your
places.
Yeah, places and numbers.
If you're just coming for all the lunches and all the breaks, that. All right. So this is a setup for today in terms of how we'd like to present ethics. And I'm serious when I said this is an opportunity we saw to bring experts together and talk together about what it means to serve in industry, what challenges you come up with, how do we teach it, how do we learn it, all of those things, because I think here's what comes with teaching for 20 years. I realized that 80% or 90% of what I actually said, nobody actually listened to over 20 years. We learn by doing, right? Now, how do you do ethics? That seems like a dangerous business, all right? You can't really fail at it when you're just practicing it, right? And I think the best way we can do it is share experiences and stories and challenges and things we've confronted. That's a good way to sort of practice. It's the best way we can do ethics education. So we're leaning on you all to help out here as we just set the table, and we'll go into a couple different discussions, and we hope you find that valuable. All right? If nothing else, I think one of the important things we do with PDH hours is we say, tell you what, you always have plenty to do at work or in your academic world preparing syllabi or just dealing with clients and constituents. Sometimes it's just good to step out into a different space and shift your mental gears into thinking intentionally about it for 2 hours, and that has value as well. So that's part of what we're setting up here. All right. With that, we're going to start with reviewing some of the foundational documents. We're going to go back to the societies, ASCE, ASME, IEEE, Chemical Engineering, AI, CHE. Those are the ones I'm going to lean on most. We're going to look at what they all say in their code of ethics. So we're going to hopefully review those. Maybe it's been a while since we've actually seen those. What's the foundation for which we develop a professional ethic or a code of ethic? I'm going to take all of those and summarize them, say what's common about all of them, so you get a sense of what seems to be consistent through all of them. Again, just getting more familiar with them once again if we haven't seen them for a while. And then we're going to talk about where do they come from? What are the frameworks? But maybe if there's anything that we want to take from this session or offer to you, it's this. Codes of ethics are dead documents. They don't do anything in bullet point format. They don't do anything as written documents. Well, no code of ethics. Even biblically, no code of ethics ever does anything until it takes life in us, right? Until it gets internalized. And until it gets sort of reshaped for the space and the time and the projects that we're working on. So what we'd like to emphasize in this particular ethics session is that practice of doing that. I'm going to call it catechizing. How many of you grew up in a catechism type tradition at all? Okay, still a good number. I didn't know if that was still, I grew up in a Lutheran background, so I had Luther's small catechism. Actually, it was Luther's small catechism explained, as if I couldn't understand his small catechism nor his large catechism. I don't know. I actually illustrate that because you know what's going on there? There's a communal reiteration, a communal revisiting of that catechism. Well, we do that in our faith traditions. Do we do it in our professional traditions? I'm going to posit that I think we should, and that's one of the things I want you to take with you. So we're going to look at the intersection of how we teach ethics and how we practice ethics. Those things that, how challenging they become in both of those contexts. So after that, we're going to transition to 2 papers from this conference. Unbeknownst to the authors of these papers, we dovetailed them into our ethics session because we thought this is really good examples of how Christians wrestle with ethical frameworks. And so I think you'll see how they fit, even though they really weren't written at all for this, they fit in there as well. All right. Some of these slides have way too much text on them.
He's from Dordt College.
Yeah. Believe in the power of words, even if you can't read them. Right? Believe me, I chose the very shortest one to put up here. Congratulations, IEEE folks. You used the fewest words. 1 word less than ASME. 195 versus 196. All right, I did a word count on it. So, to give you an example of one of the codes of ethics that we typically base sort of our testing, our professional engineering on, right? What does it contain in there? And some of these will be familiar to you, all right? The basic responsibility for safety, health, and welfare of the public. That phrase comes through many times. Avoid real or perceived conflicts of interest. The conflict of interest clause will always be there in all of these codes of ethics as well. Disclosure, openness of communication will be there. Honesty, realistic claims stated. Bribery, sometimes singled out by itself, sometimes in a combination of others. improve the understanding of technology, its appropriate application. In other words, there's an educational ethic required of us as well. Right? Maintain and improve our technical competence, seek and accept honest criticism, acknowledge errors, treat fairly all persons, avoid injuring others, their property, reputation, employment, assist colleagues and coworkers in professional development. That's pretty common to see that kind of verbiage. I did a quick, everybody needs a little chart in their presentation. So I took all of them and I read through them and I looked at them. What's these common pieces and parts that we see in all of them that come through, and actually what seems to be missing in some of them? Again, I summarized them: honesty, practice, responsibility. I tried to restate them all in a positive way. Some of them are stated negatively in some of the documents, and that's fine too. Avoid, some things just simply need to be avoided. Practice responsibility, practice and protect communal trust. That's where bribery, conflicts of interest, breaches of confidentiality fall under. Practice open communication. Is that the same thing? Interestingly enough, there's this clause, and maybe we don't necessarily pay attention to it as much. In our highly technical world, they are asking us to say, you need to let the public know what's going on. Even at an informational level, even if it doesn't affect their public welfare, the public has a right to know how it works. And sometimes I think it's so easy to, well, we're engineers, we get it done, tell you what, you got the end result. But there's an obligation that we have to letting folks know as well what's going on in technology. All right, practice justice, practice humility. Know your limits is always in there. Interesting in that. Benevolence, lifelong learning, in other words, continuing education like this, and care for the environment is beginning to come into these documents. It wasn't there before, and still isn't quite there in IEEE or AICHE explicitly. Right? I found that interesting as well. So work towards sustainable development. So just a little bit of cross-chart comparison there. Here's some outliers I don't know what to do with. And it's on the back of that worksheet if you want to explore, or maybe later we can think of some questions around that. I wonder why these aren't there. Part of me as a history of technology person knows why some of these are there because of the history of the organization. The turn of the century. There's extra copies here, so raise your hand if you don't have a copy. Some of these are pay attention to the prestige of the profession. Interesting verbiage. I was wondering why is it my ethical responsibility to make sure that the profession has prestige? So, to me, that'd be an interesting one to discuss and take a look at. But at the turn of the century, that was an important thing for engineers to be seen as a responsible unit. So that prestige was, we're a community, and people look at engineers as a community, and we need to make sure that we represent that community well. All right, however that verbiage is, and maybe we feel a little uncomfortable with it, this occasionally comes in. I don't know where to necessarily place it, but I think it's a historical sort of place that trying to define a profession at the turn of the century. So here's where I'm going to lead up to our discussion. Prescriptive-only ethics. That chart of 1 through 8, when you just have a list of that, and actually prescriptive ethics of any kind are inherently, I would say, ineffectual. They don't do anything until we take them in a certain way. And I think ethical codes require 3 actions of what I call becoming. Ultimately, they must be tried on. You need to know them, but to be tried on means to be learned and taught at the same time. I think, we go back and forth, learning and teaching, and that's how we learn the best. They try them, and then they need to be owned. We need to internalize them, but not just internalize them like word for word. Internalize them means bring them into our setting, into our context. Put more words on them if you need words, or put more habits on them, or put more practices on them, whatever you need in your particular context. And then they need to be maintained. You need to go back to them. Regularly reviewed and refreshed in community. I hope no code of ethics is ever stagnant word-wise, but I hope it's never stagnant in terms of how we operate with it. All right? And this is important because it's always done in community. You can't do this yourself, that maintenance. Now, my analogy comes from my background in
catechism, my faith upbringing. All right, like I said, I actually lived in a number of catechisms. I was never really home in any particular church, so I got Heidelberg, I got Westminster, I got Luther. I don't know what I'm missing. Maybe there's something else out there too. So I've seen them all. I've worked through them all. I use Heidelberg. It's a beautiful catechism. I like it as well. But my point is this: I'm going to put up for you a code that many of us are familiar with. 1 through 10. By the way, do you know that us different faith traditions don't always number them the same way? How many people are familiar with that? Okay. I was so confused as a kid because 1 and 2 are 1 for Lutherans, right? And we covet houses and then we covet other things, and those are 2 different commandments. Just thought I'd let you know that. So we call them the 10 Commandments. We think everybody knows the 10 Commandments, but just different. All right. Bottom line is we don't have to count. All right. But what is fascinating about the catechism culture is this, and all the catechisms you see, is they don't let these words stay as they are in sometimes way too narrow form. Take, for instance, the 2nd commandment. What is idolatry? Heidelberg Catechism. Idolatry is having or inventing something. I love that because it was an engineering conference. I thought, that's a good word for us to ruminate on. It's inventing something, okay? It's not just creating something out of brass or, right? It's something that we place on a throne, and it can be as technical as a gear or a cog, in which you put your trust in instead of or in addition to the only true God who has revealed himself in his word. Okay. The point is not to flesh out the 10 Commandments. My point is, what does it mean to catechize? Okay, we taught the 10 Commandments by doing this. You see how it's already expanded? It's not just sort of that narrow view of making idols anymore, but it actually brings me into my technological world. Another example would be this. What does God forbid in the 8th commandment? You shall not steal. This is Heidelberg. Again, catechizing. God forbids not only outright theft and robbery, but also such wicked schemes and devices as false weights and measures, deceptive merchandising, counterfeit money, or excessive interest, usury. We must not defraud our neighbor anyway, whether by force or show of right. In addition, God forbids all greed and all abuse of squandering his gifts, or abuse or squandering his gifts. Now, I mention that because within that command, you shall not steal, an ethical code, you find even a basis for caring for the environment. Okay? You notice that? Immediately, you wouldn't think of that. You wouldn't think, you shall not steal, and see a care and for the environment or a sustainability ethos. But you do as you catechize that particular code of ethics. Right? God forbids all greed. You can hear some of the professional ethics in there, right? Bribes, kickbacks. It's there as well. All right? It's not just about stealing. Now, where am I going with this? Well, let me make an argument for catechizing anything. That catechizing in itself, that practice, which may not be as common for us, it's maybe sort of old school, I'm offering that maybe you should bring it back again. In other words, catechizing professional documents, can you do that? Well, my argument for it is that folks like C.S. Lewis in his Abolition of Man's book argues that there are some things that simply transcend faith backgrounds. In other words, there's these fundamental Tao-ness of humanity, that we have a law of general benefits, a law of special duties to parents, duties to children, posterity, laws of justice. These aren't things we create, these are embedded in humanity, all right? Laws of good faith and truthfulness, law of mercy, law of generosity. In other words, there's commonality. I can talk about the 10 Commandments, I can talk about something even more general, and I can also step into IEEE codes and have confidence that it's rooted in something that we share as humanity, and therefore actually begs to be catechized. In other words, we share it with humanity, but begs to be brought into our lives in a real and active way. So this is where I just set up the problem. I'd like to try a little exercise like that. If you needed the analogy, in other words, do not steal, and you want to think about how Heidelberg catechizes it for that faith tradition, then I'd like you to think about, from an engineering standpoint, to pick a particular, let's use IEEE because I put it on your sheet so that you have it in front of you. Let's take the IEEE Code of Ethics. You also have the summary that I put together that sort of pulls all of those codes together. But I'd like to try something as obvious or basic as number 4. What don't you understand about bribery, right? Except that's what I was thinking about stealing until Heidelberg got a hold of me. All right, I thought I knew that, right? Bribery. As a professional ethic, this is where I would like us to sort of speak into that. What does that mean? I'd love for you to talk in your table about, well, there's the obvious, all right? But what about the spirit of it? What more is there if we were to get together and discuss? What's entailed in the bribery ethos? And what are we called to do instead? Or what are we called to avoid in a broad way? So I think there's enough thoughtful and creative folk and stories and experiences here that I'd like to get tables together, write down a broader, catechized teaching definition that you could use from your experience on that one. And then I'm going to open it up to go to another one and do the same thing. It's an exercise of unfolding or unpacking these codes of ethics. Right? So this is where I'll have you guys stand up. There's a few more industry folk, and we really need you guys interspersed among some of the academic folk because you have stories that we don't have, and that would be good. So if you are situated around folks that are all sort of in the same area, see if one or two of you can get up and shift to another table, and within a couple minutes get blended at a table and deal with discussion question number 1 on this sheet. And you can keep open the IEEE. And then in a few minutes, 10 minutes or so, I'd like to hear from you and see what your group has come up with and see if I raised a good enough question. Okay. Go ahead and gather. See if you can mix just a little bit. So you have, ideally, one industry person at each table.
Yeah. Oh, it's right here. It is training. Yeah, that's how we cheat those.
Hey. Yeah. A little bit, mostly.
There's actually no harm in introducing each other. Okay, so know where you come from, what your background is.
Hi, I'm Jim.
And Jordan. Yeah, so your research and engineering.
They can, I mean, I think there's, anyone
No, I'm a biologist.
Yeah, we're toward Princeton, right?
Yeah, sometimes you kind of think that moves pretty slow.
And she's helping with the live stream. Which somebody watched here was like, somebody. Yeah. I actually was mainly doing it just for the video.
So sometimes
Somebody emailed me wanting that spreadsheet. I was like, thanks for the live stream. You know what else going on. I was like, wow, you're just for that. All right, pass it. So to reject bribery in all its forms. Basically, I can come before. So that's the same. And how would we flesh that out?
look at it as far as.
Came to my mind, potential for favoritism or
basically, if you give preferential treatment to a certain thing,
set their papers late or whatever.
Straight out, here's the point, but you really consider these guys to be some kind
There's a lot of it.
A lot of like something to even decisions. Pure
Company decide on which generator to buy, so the $1 million generator for the one company that sells out,
this way,
and
but
like a really nice dinner and stuff.
if you do that, what's the
To tour their plant.
it's not truly.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something like that.
It's got cost associated with it. It's got satisfaction associated with it. It might not be popular with your own
Business working with someone.
What if that decision means that it's a whole bunch of rework and the project is now on way and you have a lot of
I know on the civil side, right? Civil jobs as far as like who's taking it, house.
if it's a true black say
Never really thought of right now. That right now is a big part of the relationship. But some of that, you know, that doesn't really fall into factor. Sometimes that's actually more positive side of trust. Someone who you might tend to go with, someone who you have more trust for. And that's actually, that would be certainly ethical. The relationship is very interesting. How does relationship? In the ASC code of ethics, I mean, to me, just like overseas. Some countries that, you know, like Literally,
Oh,
which is, I mean, it's interesting that like ASC code, which is an international document, it does state that big various specific. Yet you have to go finish the work without that. You know, it's sort of it's one of those things that's written down, but I mean, even like, you know, the mission organizations that we work in media, you wouldn't call it necessarily a ride. A lot of times that's what it takes is someone down there to pay somebody to get their stuff out of court. Then we just call it. Yeah. We do it. Yeah. Have a schedule. What makes it a ride? What makes it I don't know what we call it.
And it hasn't been like, or
think both, maybe. I think what he's thinking is just flushing it out, you know, sort of describing what does it mean. Getting the part of it. Yeah, so to reject bribery in all its forms. What are all its forms? Selfishness.
Almost like if you're in a situation, with that mentality, you really Anyway, it seems to me something that captures that. Genuine concern.
So, yeah, it's justifiable for a company to fly you out, treat you well. They would like to do their business, but if maybe if there's someone with real reason who just wants to have a relationship, then is that figure out right.
Suppose you were the ones organizing to have somebody outside you're flying out, you're going to would you ever say, don't, I know we're treating you well, don't look at this as we want you to go with the best.
We really want to give you information, serve you, share this information with you. When you mentioned that made me think of, you know, even say with Dordt, paying your campus visitors to come.
You don't like where is that?
We know you're probably not going to make it engineering, to get to work and take somewhere.
Yeah. Good question. I would say that yes, because you almost always serve very well. They're almost always happy. If it wasn't the case, then maybe that would be one of the things that you'd say would switch the pendulum. So get somebody to come for engineering that you know isn't going to make it an engineer. And you know they're going to be miserable, that they're going to like switch business, and then you know that's always a miserable experience. So that, I guess that's just going to be it. I personally know ways that it's very so much in the contract and signing it to your contract. 2 years from now, if it's signed, probably tell them that they're different. They're going to come in with their you're really like service. But everybody's incentivized that after 2 years, they will continue to buy it.
All right, let's see what we have come up with a bit. Time constraints are always challenging. It sounds like a good discussion. I hope we'll be able to exchange some ideas. I'm not going to call it any table numbers here or anything, so I don't pick on people. But any group willing to volunteer a catechizing attempt that you did in 10 minutes?
You said again.
Yeah. Anybody volunteer their catechism attempt of bribery? Don't practice it.
By which you mean
What
a
does that
question
mean?
and an answer?
How did you expand that into industry or teaching, whatever your background is? What did it look like? What did it grow to? Anybody want to offer that? Okay, go for it. Then second.
So we talked about.
You have to speak up too, I think, because the back corner can't.
I'll put my projection voice on. We talked about bribery as either allowing your engineering judgment of making a particular decision to be influenced by factors not related to that decision, whether that be a relationship or a gift or whatever form that may take, but allowing that decision to be influenced, or attempting to influence someone else's decision making through factors not related to that decision.
So more than just a financial transaction there. There's something that's about a boundary of the decision standing alone that speaks to.
Ours was similar, just sort of restated. Bribery is anything that distracts or persuades someone away from rational, empirical decision making.
Okay. Keeping rational decision making. Decision making is entered in both of them. It's not included in that original text, but you're bringing that into it to give it some depth there.
We had two related concepts that felt like it was close to bribery in that same decision, but we weren't sure whether to call it that or not. Favoritism and blackmail. Both might sway decision, but it's not a positive result for you necessarily, but it felt like it was in the same category.
Favoritism, blackmail, adding to that sort of list, building on the boundaries of that.
I have two other words, but we talked about generosity and incentivizing in the same conversation.
Generosity is such a beautiful word to put in a bribe category.
Really, we didn't necessarily put it in the bribe category, but it's a fuzzy.
Okay.
We had a similar. We threw a positive word in the mix too, and couldn't figure out what the boundary was, and that was trust.
Ooh.
If you have somebody that you very much trust, and you might actually not be able to on paper make a rationalization that is the best decision, but you trust them. So we struggled that we kind of got stuck there because then we struggled to say, well, how do we draw that line? Like, where's the line?
Because trust seems such a positive thing to build and maintain.
Yeah.
But if it's placed wrongly or begins to trump generosity, unpack that just a little bit more for me.
Oh, yeah.
Well, when I was thinking, what is it you're doing to something out of the goodness of your heart, right? You appreciate the work that somebody's doing, with you, and you want to say, hey, I appreciate this, and I'd like to, give you this thing, as a way of showing my appreciation tangibly.
Performance bonus at work.
Okay.
What is that?
Yeah.
We give our administrative assistants.
Well, we bribe all the time in the academic world. It's called grades.
So this is maybe a little bit meta, but we said that we were describing what the catechism would look like, and it would enumerate the concepts behind the prohibition and the different types of bribery with some examples. And one of the things that came up as a concept is that the basis for decision making isn't transparent.
Oh, interesting.
So getting behind that.
Did you hear that?
Maybe part of the crux of is it generous or is it a bribe has to do with the level of transparency.
That's interesting. Now we're crossing over into some of the other codes too, which so it can fall either way, but I think that's good. That circle gets stretched around there.
I think motive would have something to do with it too. Like what's my underlying motive, whether it's transparent or not. What's my underlying motive for doing the thing?
I think there's also a difference. We were talking about generosity. Generosity is not necessarily, you don't necessarily, when you're generous, you don't expect something back in return. And I think that's when you start talking about bribery, that's when you're kind of implying that then you should do something, or you're explicitly trying to get them to do something in return. You have that transaction, whereas generosity is just, hey, I'm going to give you this just as it is.
Yeah, I think that's where the year-end bonus, separates that. I think the intent of a bribe is that somebody has a loyalty to some group of people and you're attempting to switch that loyalty to you, as opposed to, I guess I think of a year-end bonus as either way, they're working 40 hours a week for you. That's more of a thanks. You're not trying, hopefully you're not trying to say, why don't you work 60 hours and not be with your family? You know, the intent isn't to break a loyalty and replace it with yours.
Loyalty is a good word, positive word too, though, isn't it? So, yeah.
So I think while motive does differentiate between a bribe and generosity, one of the difficult things about that in an actual situation comes up at the beginning of Code 2, where it talks about conflicts of interest, which are very related to bribes. It says to avoid real or perceived conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, motive is not something that is typically visible. I mean, maybe that's where some of that transparency comes in, but that I think that combination causes us to be even careful of how our generous acts would be perceived, because we have that ethical obligation as well.
Paying attention. This is why we need to revisit in community, because we wake ourselves up to some things that seem to be normal practice in wherever we're working. Now, it has different languages. I remember we used to say we built relationships with customers, right? And clients. Built relationships could mean some golf outings, could mean some, okay, maybe that's okay, right? Sort of, maybe, but then there was every once in a while. I mean, I always felt like, okay, we called it building relationships, but how much was tied to their future business? How much was the line that we needed to draw? I don't think that's a clear one, but we need to in community to go back and forth on those things. So one more.
Just bouncing off that, we were talking about working in the Middle East and Asia. A lot of companies do that. It gets really, really complicated. In China, the expectation is if I did a project, that I need to thank the government official who allowed me to do a project. And so I would bring from America small gifts to them. And so, but sometimes Americans, if you're from an American point of view, oh, there's a conflict of interest. But from the Chinese, if you didn't do it, it's like, what's wrong with you? You don't know our culture. I'm not going to work with you again because you're just trouble.
That's exactly why these kind of discussions need to happen, and those 10 points don't always work for us. So my message, I hopefully gets through, because this has been a wonderful discussion, is that we need to do this more often. If this is the only 2 hours we've done it, then we're not going to live out ethical, professional ethics. Somehow we need to create space for this even in our places, academics, teaching, or industry as well. So, very good. I appreciate that. But I need to give Kevin some time. We'll go into a little more sort of framework and background, and then we'll get back to you again to do a little more discussing.
We hope at the end to save some time to come back to this second question at the very end. I think this could be very beneficial for maybe particularly for the educators to kind of hear testimonies from the industrial folks. Is everybody?
And just before he gets started, maybe quietly, this can be passed around. Has anyone not signed up for the PDHs they hope to get? Then maybe we'll send it down the middle row if whoever does.
Thank you, Nolan. So ethical frameworks. If you've taught engineering, or engineering ethics, you've probably dealt with ethical frameworks at some point. We use, we have been using Ethics in Engineering by Martin and Schinziger. It's currently out of print, so we are twiddling our thumbs trying to figure out what to do next. But, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, but we thought that it might be valuable for us to just review these ethical frameworks a bit. They're, in a sense, they're pre-code, right? It's kind of what the code is built on. And ethical frameworks, like the code, lean on this Tao, like Ethan was just talking about, this underlying sense of right and wrong. And we see that more broadly in culture, right? That people generally understand that we want other people to be ethical, that it's important that ethics be functional in our societies to maintain the things that we hold dear. So there's many common ends that we're all after, and different ways of articulating it. So stable society, clean air and water, safe environment, an ability to prosper and flourish. I think most people have a sense, even if they're not believers, right, that it's important to keep selfishness in check, right? Material security, we can make a long list. And really, ethical frameworks then are theoretical articulations of some of that language. When we get together like we are and think about what we value and why we value it and how we can make decisions based on what we value. How we justify those oughts. We ought to respect others, etc. And I think already we've identified some of the value in doing this and in sort of reflecting our own thinking process, maybe approaching our work in a more thoughtful way going forward. But it's also good to understand what other people their frameworks, where they may be coming from as we work together with others day to day. Before we get to frameworks, though, we kind of need to go back to something more basic. I've labeled it as heart motives, but really it has many titles. Ground motives is another one. That's an old one that I kind of like. But it's a person's internalized understanding of who they are, of how the world works, and their role in it. So really, who they are, right? How they've come to be and what's their purpose. And so often, I think, people don't necessarily, have not necessarily thought about that. They go to day functioning from some basic internalized understanding without really reflecting on what that understanding is or how it might direct them or whether it's appropriate or not. Sometimes we've called this worldview, an internal life compass, loves that we chase after, a more recent one. And this is important because what's in our hearts really shapes how we define what is good and defines how we make choices about our work or whatever is involved. And it helps us define the good life in a sense. And this is true of everyone, believers or not. Sets our priorities, serves as the basis for making choices. So as we get into the ethical frameworks, and I don't want to spend a lot of time because I really sent some good discussion and would like to throw you back in discussion as quickly as possible. So I'm going to buzz through some of this. There's summaries on your handout. Not everything that's on the handout is in the presentation. Not everything in the presentation is on the handout. So it's up to you to make those all agree if you like. Utilitarianism is a ends justify the means kind of ethical framework that we society should strive to achieve the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And there's two different varieties. I'm not going to, I think that's on the handout, so that'll be good. And there's good parts of each of these frameworks. I'm going to sort of highlight weaknesses as we go along here. But each of these actually, as a Christian, there's parts of these frameworks that I can resonate with. Partly because they all are tied back to some of that common ground that we all hold dear. In this case, utilitarianism leans on a definition of good, and that may be something we don't all agree on. Even different types of good, dollars versus aesthetics, right? How do you compare those two very different things when you're trying to maximize the amount of good? Whose good are we concerned about? Are we required to think internationally at this point? I would certainly argue so. How about future generations? Do they play a role in our calculation of good. And probably the biggest flaw is that in this framework, the group can be prioritized or even sacrificed, or the individual can be sacrificed for the group. As long as the calculation works out that we've achieved greater good, the individual is expendable. So I'm just going to put all three of these up. Virtue ethics, rights-based ethics, and duty ethics. Virtue ethics is a system that we're most familiar with. Our legal system, obviously, in the United States is based on this. And there's some clear advantages to that. We see that living itself out in our culture. A weakness, though, is that it's a bit individualistic. It can be, right? So each of us is sort of required to stake out our own territory. This is my right. Stay off my property, right? It's a sort of a defensive kind of approach to life. Whereas duty ethics is sort of the flip side of that. That I have an obligation to respect you, right? And to me that sounds a bit more biblical. But it is less clearly defined as what the rights-based approach is. So there's benefits and weaknesses in each of these. Self-realization ethics. These are interesting. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to delve into these. But in essence, a self-realization framework is promoting the individual's realization of themselves. So you should make decisions that fulfill yourself, that would allow you to be fulfilled. Okay? And these feelings of fulfillment can come through community commitments, like devotion to the environment or to poor, right? So solar energy, whatever. You can have a very narrow focus that guides your decision-making process. What's interesting is the authors actually will put Christianity in this category, self-realization. So the Bible tells me to do something, and I do it, and that makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I'm justified, that I'm doing God's work. And so it's very easy, and I think each of us would feels that tension. I think we should. Am I giving to this because it's from my heart, or am I giving it to this because someone else will see it and congratulate me on that, or whatever, right? There's always, I think, that tension. And this last one, and even the authors of this text thrash on ethical egoism, where it's just self-centered, right? You do whatever benefits you, even if you're thinking long-term, not just short-term, but even long-term. Really, the authors would claim undermine much of what we hold dear, and much of what we hold in common in terms of society. So the weaknesses, motivations, these are really not frameworks, any of these, as much as they are motivations for action. Too narrow, too rigid, social discord, biblical ethics, we're talking our way through those already more broadly. So not to skip over them, but in the interest of time. So we have this little diagram where we have our world views, our internal motives, our heart beliefs, impacting ethical frameworks. Ethical frameworks, if you collect them together, you see the commonalities between these things, and those inform the code. That's really where codes of ethics are derived from, distilled from. But what's interesting, I think at least, is that ethical code then, as Ethan was talking about, has to be applied, has to be lived, and really our hearts come back into play as we live it out. Right? into our daily actions. So not just ethical dilemmas, perhaps, but all of our actions in a day have ethical implications, right? They impact other people somehow. So that's a bit of an interesting one. But then it's also true that there has to be feedback from our actions back into the frameworks, into our heart. So a conference like this actually gives us an opportunity to reflect about, what do I really believe, and how should that be shaped? Another way of saying it, leaning on idolatry again a little bit. And then switching gears a bit to ethical dilemmas. Often when you talk about engineering ethics, people think of ethical dilemmas as sort of the focus, rather than this daily action by action sort of approach to ethics. But ethical dilemmas often come up when we have split loyalties. So you have loyalty to your employer, but you also, by code, have loyalty to the public, the greater public. You have loyalties to your family, your responsibilities, your callings there, but also to your employer. So when those things collide is where we often see ethical dilemmas arise. So our next discussion prompt, maybe we can see if we can make this one a shorter one, but this is a quote from the textbook. So sound ethics and good business go together for the most part and in the long run. And I'm just curious what sort of reactions you have about that, whether there's personal examples or counterexamples, and would like you to just discuss at your tables. Maybe we'll do, what do you think, 5 minutes? See what you can get accomplished in 5 minutes. You're not writing a catechism, so it should take you less time than the previous ones.
Yes,
I've always thought when I've heard that it sounds like wishful thinking.
Yeah.
I think in the long run and the broad run, not just for your company, but for
every company is that
every full business culture. Because that creates stability, long-term sustainability.
For your particular company, you have
For a long time. Not forever, but for a pretty long time. That's where,
It may be not even quite as unethical, but actually just different companies that are working from a little bit different ethical framework. Like even if you think about the different frameworks that, it's sort of all of us individually probably unintentionally sort of tend toward maybe say either a values-based ethics framework or a service-based framework, rather than in business you have companies that, there's probably not a single company that's ever said this is our ethical framework, right? This is our ethical framework, but they end up having one, right? Everybody has to have one. Well, then when you're working with different frameworks,
That is brought up on tonight, when they lay people off, there's a tension between providing for the school, Ethiopia. Well, do we care just about the long run in America, or do we care about the long run everywhere?
supporting high school in Ethiopia, and they kept supporting it even when the company was losing jobs. It inspired me.
So what sort of specific things are you thinking about in terms of like what would be unethical but seeming good business, right? Because that would be the dilemma that this question would bring out. Like sort of saying it'd be great if it was wasn't. Good business has to be right. Is that what I don't know? Is that what we're saying?
I think the state. I guess I agree with the statement. And maybe it's where it says for the most part.
Yeah.
Or, no, I don't know if I'd say it that way. I'd say in the long and in the broad.
Okay.
Really big picture. But it might be to your hurt personally or to the hurt of the company. And so what is good business?
Okay.
It might hurt good your company.
So yeah.
So maybe your company needs to go.
Right. Yeah, I see. Yeah, so good. So it has to do with what the definition of good business is. So broadly or very narrowly, and probably the more narrow you think the more places you run into like the atoms.
I mean, part of the sound ethics is being willing to. Part of sound ethics is being willing to take the hurt for the sake of.
I don't think it's not unethical to be dishonest, is it? I think I promised you 5 minutes, because I'm not going to give you 5 minutes. We want to get to that. We want to get to that other question too. So let's take
between timelines. So read that.
Yeah.
Between timelines. I know.
Time pressure.
Feel that.
Inappropriate time pressure. So let's just real quick. We'll take volunteers again. If you just have a couple of pithy stories or things that came up in your discussion, please feel free to share them. So I'll take. Does anybody have anything that? Yeah.
Well, I kind of controlled the conversation over here, and I apologize for that. But what kind of hit me there is one. I would love to hear the counterpoint because I don't know how you could not agree with that statement.
Okay.
Now we did talk about the good business. What's the definition of good business? But I guess what I kind of hit on is, for my job, what I do, working with drainage districts in Northwest Iowa, I'm working on things that got installed in 1909 through 1920 and has not been touched since. Nobody has seen that tile since it went into the ground, and I'm expected to replace it or repair it and have the same type of longevity. Well, where does that term in the long run fall out for everybody else? What other industry has a 100-year lifespan with no preventative maintenance as your expectation?
Very good. Others? Counterpoints, maybe that.
So I'll give you the counterpoint.
Yeah.
Street cars were common in the 20s and 30s until the big American automakers launched essentially a war against streetcars and sold automobiles instead. And we now have a transportation system and a built infrastructure that was good for them, but not good for the public. And if you're interested in watching the documentary film on that, I can show you the link.
Yes, Doug.
So that reinforces the conclusion that I think we came to at our table, that the statement is true, but the consequences of bad business can be so serious that they will never clearly come to light or be rectified.
So eternity, maybe an eternity. that's sort of the long run, isn't it?
Another counterpoint is if you're contracting, you're competing for the same contracts, but this company A is not ethical, but they're getting all the contracts because they know the people, they're buttering their bread, they're taking them to playing golf, and they're getting on the business, and then you go out of the business because you're not going to be unethical. So you're not around for the long run.
That's an interesting point too, yes. Yep.
So if you, I'll add the documentary side. If you haven't seen The Devil You Know, it's really interesting. It's on Netflix. It's about DuPont and Teflon. But it brings this up where sound ethics and good business, because business was really good for the sell of Teflon is, and they're now other products. But in the long run, what's been the impact, and are they realizing the impact, or are we realizing the impact of that society? So that's another interesting.
Okay, I think maybe we'll just leave it at that. I hope you had very fruitful discussions at each of your table. It'd be fun. We were just saying we probably could have planned the whole afternoon for some of the valuable discussions and insights that are being raised in this. But we'll head to the next question. I think we have time for it. Yep.
Part of what the purpose of this is to get us consciously thinking about how we learn and know ethics, and fundamentally how we embody it in the end. And we were curious, maybe this is an ulterior motive as educators, but we teach ethics in class. Does it work? Maybe say this 2 hours just didn't work either, but yeah. I'm curious, where do we learn? I'm curious around your table, and this is where I do sort of maybe instead of sort of a longer discussion, I'd be curious if you can go and each of you think of a sentence of what first comes to mind. Where did you learn, truly learn ethics? And it doesn't have to be a school, maybe it's an experience, maybe I'm curious what the overall group would come up with. And then would that help around the table, both us in industry know, what's the most effective way to work with our teams and colleagues in terms of consciously training ourselves, catechizing again and again on ethics, but also for educators. What would be the best way that we can reach our students and begin them on the right path of catechizing the ethics thinking? So does that make sense? I say too much in my questions. I have a bad habit. All right? So really what I'm asking for is just a quick thought. Where did I learn professional ethics? Period.
What's the best way?
What's the best way? Okay. Curious. So very quickly, go around your table, boom, 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 and see if we get a
working at
Question 2, page 3.
You select and ask 2 questions. Where did you learn? And what's the best
My dad wrote a book about
I'm not sure though. It's actually not a very easy question. You usually have an easy answer to where you learned ethics. Because so much of it just happens along the way, right? I don't think you ever feel like you don't know ethics at all. You're always expanding.
I mean, it might be terrible at it.
Yeah, right.
You still think you know it.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they're justified.
I think kids learn ethics to at least age 5 for sure.
Yeah. But my 12-year-old would definitely think that she has some ethics. She wouldn't understand where they were coming from either taught her. They're not her parents on this side. I think, because, I mean, in some ways I actually still feel like I don't have a really good grasp of, like, what the industrial, professional world views ethics. You just sit down on what the standard questions are that come, like, from the code, all the codes of ethics, and how specifically, like, the industry thinks it's supposed to apply. I'm still not sure I know that as well as I should. Okay. Okay. So that is, I mean, that is very hard to a framework for ethics, right? I mean, you could say that's in some ways maybe probably like the framework for ethics. Yeah.
Yeah, mostly bigger. Yeah, I was thinking they're ethical training programs. Yeah, it's kind of cheesy when it was that. I think going on, but actually pretty good and pretty support. The ones that actually stick around are going to be you know, they didn't go to plan immediately what you're talking about. No, we're going to do what we're going to do. That means
I would like to think
All right.
Here, we're having a
We're not done thinking and talking about this, but I do have to provide space for a couple of case studies in Christians thinking about particular areas of ethics and ethical frameworks that we'll have in the next couple of papers. Real quick, in a minute. We can do it in a minute. Where'd you learn? How do we teach ethics? Do you want to volunteer?
I'm not sure you actually want my feedback on teaching ethics. But something that I picked up on, it was like the beginning of your abstract, and largely in education, we come up with these kind of cerebral examples. And in education classes, to look at real world examples, to look at things that are happening today right around, in Toast in the spring to start, rather than coming up with book examples to say, what's happening with Boeing? What would we do as Christian engineers in Boeing right now as this is happening, right? Like those kinds of real world ethical scenarios to be able to look at, and I think it's largely example. I think we learn ethics by example a lot, by looking at the professionals that we know around us and say, what are they doing? What are they doing that's okay? What do he say are okay and not okay, and why? And then saying, so looking at real world examples of real situations, and then see what people are doing and saying, is that something I would do or I wouldn't do? I think that's at least for me, I learned a lot through seeing other people living out their own ethics.
Next year, this time, you have to provide 2 stories from your experiences this year. You just raised your hand. Other thoughts on ethical learning, teaching? I hear experience. That came out. You said 2 things, actually, right?
Supposed to learn it at home from your parents to start with.
It's deeper than courses, right? It's deeper. We live into it, so don't. And the problem is we live into it in wrong ways as well, right? I look back on things that I held and I acted on, and I thought, why did I grew up in a framework that really wasn't stepping perfectly in the right direction. And in discussion in the community, I found that out, but we do. It comes early.
I think the word you just said is really important. We look back. And sometimes in the educational community, it's creating a space for introspection. They encourage you students to introspect on a topic like ethics. What does that person really look like? Before you define what your ethics should be as an engineer, what are your personal ethics? Do you actually know what those are? And how did you determine them? And how does that play into how you determine your human ethics? A lot of people just don't think about it. It's not something that as you go about your day, you think, well, I wonder why I made that decision.
Because you can short circuit that little diagram that Kevin put up there, right? Because you can go from what's in the heart right to the action. And the whole point is that really that needs to shape these codes, frameworks. But we don't have to go back there. That's the danger. We don't. But it's healthy, essential that we do.
It took me a few years of going over ethical frameworks before I really kind of was able to think about, okay, here's a situation and a decision was made, and be able to think, okay, what was the ethical framework that's involved? If we can slow down and think about how specific decisions have been made, what was the framework used to make that decision? Is the framework one that I agree with? I made this decision, did I make it unselfish, egoistic, ethical egoism, for instance, framework? I I think a lot of our ethical decisions are actually made in that framework and we don't even know it. So if we kind of slow down and think about how decisions were made, or maybe it's a utilitarian decision, we will find later that we're using a utilitarian framework, we're not even aware we're making it. We need to slow down enough, and having names for those frameworks is helpful. Otherwise, how do we even know? It's harder to identify how we have made decisions and then how we can make decisions going forward. But it took me like 3 or 4 years of doing this until I realized, wow, I make a lot of decisions according to ethical egoism. And public policy arguments are almost all utilitarianism. Anti-smoking campaigns are all ethical egoism. So it's like, whoa, that was kind of enlightening, but it took me a while to get there.
That's good. I need to wrap up this conversation. Yeah, you're an incredibly good class, and that's a problem. Usually you get people just staring at each other after 5 minutes, and then you know you can stop discussion, but you guys kept the volume going. So it's great to read this. It gives us ideas for the future. I'd love to. Thanks for letting us do a first try on this and explore some of these conversations and then more. We won't end, but I want to give you just a little stand-up break here, stretch break as we let the next presenters get set up to go. So you want to stretch, you want to grab just a cup of coffee, and be back in here in a couple minutes as they set up their presentation.
Yeah, we have a longer break at 3, so but feel free to, if you go out, come back in, don't start a conversation.
Don't be president.
They're a little bit older than I am. It's not hot.
At least like method of acting.
I appreciate it. So I stopped my water.
So, you going to become a professor? At Christian College?
Potentially, and he's been interested in going to undergrad. I was and then the contrast of now being it. And so I definitely think the learning environment is something like that. And if I teach that, I'm going to be able to do that. Who knows exactly what happened. Yeah. So I have coincidentally undergrad assistant, and then we're years of undergrad. No.
Go ahead and have a seat. Try to get started. We do have a half-hour break scheduled after this, so I think what we'll do is we'll just go to about 3:05. We'll do our 2 20-minute blocks, 2:25 to 2:45, and 2:45 to 3:05, and try to be about wrapped up at that point. So there may be a few others coming in yet, because I think there's a few out in the hallway, but come on in. But I will go ahead and get started. For some reason, this computer didn't like my font. I apologize. I wasn't trying to look so digital with my font. But, you're good. We're gonna just put them there, and there's nothing wrong with it. So looks a little bit different than I was intending. My name is Justin Vandorf. I am a teacher at Dordt too, as many of you know. What I'm doing is, I think, maybe a wrap-up of what I've done over the course of a few conferences. And if you look back at proceedings, this is sort of a continuing work. So it wasn't really initially developed to be sort of in this ethics-specific session. But when we were thinking about doing this in the 2-hour block, it certainly is a framework, and I've never really called it an ethical framework before, but I think you could call it that. One way that we've been wrestling with a little bit, a framework that informs how we do engineering work. I'll get to those names on the bottom in a couple slides in, so a couple of them are in the room already though, so maybe I'll put them on the spot a little bit in here as we go too, and make this a little bit interactive as we go. We'll see how it goes. How this work started was quite a few years ago now, actually, 10, 11 years ago when I came back and started teaching at Dordt. After having worked in the Chicago area for about 5 years in heavy industry, structural engineering type of work. One of the things that brought me back to Dordt is that as a student, I really felt compelled to wrestle with how being a Christian makes a difference every day in engineering work, and not just witnessing for Christ and going to church on Sundays, but every day how you do your engineering work. Does Christian really make a difference? So started having some conversations about this, and going back to, I think it was 2013 Christian Engineering Conference. We walked through, actually, Joel Sycamore, who's in the room here, so a lot of basement conversations, actually, because he was renting or living in my basement at that point. And we were sort of going back and forth between Dordt and Ames, sort of doing the teaching at Dordt, Iowa State PhD sort of thing. But those conversations kind of led to this, and Ethan was involved with it too, and other conversations here. But thinking about really where we started was recognizing that the story of Scripture is the Christ narrative, and the creation, fall, redemption story that all of us live in. If we think about that specifically for engineering, are there ways that it makes a difference? Are there ways that we can actually make different decisions along the way, or maybe feel like we're doing an appropriate scriptural critiquing of maybe what the industry accepts as good, as being biblical, right, and being faithful. So that sort of started the journey, just coming up with the principles, and feel free to go back to the Old Christian Engineering Conference proceedings to dive through that. I don't have time to go through all these in depth. I'll touch on them a little bit in one by one as we go forward. But a little bit of the progression then we did a little bit of work in our civil engineering curriculum, because at that time Joel was teaching with me a little bit more on the civil side. So in those courses, we never really actively brought them in, and in terms of actually teaching them, but more just exposed the students to them and got their feedback on them, and tried to use them as a way to maybe assess if we're thinking about these things as we go through some of our typical engineering content. And then a couple years ago, I took these and did my own critique of my research work, which has been largely in the area of earthquake engineering and the seismic performance of bridges under earthquake loads, which a little bit of that work got tested out pretty recently, right? But I should just say, no bridge collapses, right? How many bridge collapses do you hear about? So it's actually a testament, I think, of some ethical engineering that has been happening in Caltrans in a heavy way since '94 and the '89 significant events, right? That were actually lower ground acceleration, but a lot more damage. So anyway, that was a little bit of a side that just sort of happened right now. So I critiqued that work and said, I was doing most of that with Iowa State and with Caltrans, and how do these principles inform that? So I wanted to take it one step further, and that's where I feel like maybe I'm getting towards the end of this, but I wanted to get more feedback from people working in engineering industry right now. So not just thinking back to what I did now 11 years ago, but those working right now. How do these principles help? How maybe don't they help? How can we mold them and form them to have them serve as a framework, a way of thinking for if we're being faithful in our engineering work. So I mentioned a little bit of this. So actually, to this day, I've continued using the principles in my courses just sort of at a meta level. So every course I teach, somewhere along the line, it might be towards the beginning of the semester, it might be towards the end of the semester, I just throw the principles at the students, sort of all very similar to that previous slide, and say, engineering work you would do related to this course that we're teaching and learning right now. How do each of these principles inform that work, or don't they, right? And I even encourage that point more. Like I encourage them to push on them to say where they're, because this is by no means the biblical framework, right? And it's a helpful framework to sort of think about if we're maybe being biblically faithful, but it's just a framework, right? So I wanted to push on them. And so I'm starting to accumulate quite a bit of feedback from the students. And maybe that might be one more thing I could do is now go back and do my own data search through all of my student responses over the last 6-7 years. And we've been thinking about this in the different courses. What I'm doing now is thinking a little bit about actual real world engineering work in industry. And what I did is I asked practicing engineers that I know to critique their engineering work through the lens of these principles. And I did not make a major effort to try to get a sort of diverse group and sort of all over the country. It was sort of the low-hanging fruit. Those who I know are evangelical Christians and who care about this sort of thing and are willing to dive into this with me a little bit. So I asked and I got 4 others to work with me on this, so I'm going to share some of that with you. Gave them the guiding principles, so basically just like what you saw there, and a little more background. Like actually, this would be the typical figure that I would share with my students. You can find this in the paper too, but it has just a little bit of the sort of scriptural referencing behind the principles and sort of how think about these coming from the creation, fall, redemption narrative. But gave them these principles, and then I asked them to write a paragraph or so on each of the principles, reflecting on how it might apply to their professional work. Or if it doesn't, why it doesn't, right? And we want to have that conversation. And then we did have an in-person group meeting with, I think it was 4 of the 5 of us, so we were able to get together and talk about it afterwards, after everybody had reflected on it. What the paper is, I don't have time to give you nearly the depth or all the responses from them, but I do have several lengthy quotes in the paper from all 4 of the individuals who were involved with me, and I certainly encourage you to read through those on your own. So, who did this with me? Give them a shout out since most of them are here, but Andy Landon right there in the middle. He's sort of sheepishly, I don't know if he's going to raise was one of them. He's a practicing design engineer partner at EDA. And EDA is actually one of the sponsors of the conference too, so thanks to you guys for that. Right in town here. Contributed Jerry Van who's the one who's not here. He's a mechanical design engineer, works in town also. 19 years of experience. He was a classmate of mine when we were students at Dordt. Works for a manufacturing company that does mostly automated scales, a lot for the food industry and that sort of thing. But they do the design and the production in-house. Jason Weinberg, who's actually now not an industry person anymore, but sitting right there. So one of my fellow faculty members and has just come out of industry in close to 10 years, or was it 10 years of experience? Did I have that right?
Yeah, close to 10.
Yeah, it's close to 10. So that, yeah. At Interstates, another company in town, he was one of the other sponsors here. There's several other folks in here from Interstates too. And David Lamers, who's over there, the materials engineer, specializing in heat treating, and about 8 years of experience. So different types, and then my own experience in civil structural background. So I was trying to get a little bit of a across the different disciplines and kind of a background there. I'm still surprised to see that number now. 5 years in industry now. I've been teaching for 11 years. How did that happen? So I still feel like I'm not a teacher. So it goes. So the results. Let me just take a few minutes to just share a little bit of this with you, and maybe we can have a little bit of Q&A and conversation over this. But principle 1, to God's glory. I think, especially in our follow-up conversation, this really does affect our posture. It maybe doesn't always make us have us make a different decision, right? A different design decision than maybe someone who's not thinking about these principles would in the cubicle next to us. But it very much affects your attitude and towards what you're doing. And in terms of positives, I think that recognizing that what you're doing to God's glory does help you get through the day-to-day grind more, right? I mean, all of us have joy-filled pieces of our work. All of us have grind pieces of our work too, right? And thinking about the bigger picture, and then it's not to your glory, right? It's not to your neighbor's glory so much, right? To God's glory. That posture makes a difference. And hopefully, it does push you to think more broadly, right, about what the implications of what you're doing. a negative though, and this is the case for all of these, right? And I think I don't know if I should put him on the spot or not, but Jeremy had a very good, helpful critique of this paper, and some of the things that I've been thinking about too, and some of the downsides or dangers, right, of this framework. And one of them definitely is, I think you can pull any one of the 5 principles out, and if you use that as your only principle, it's going to be very easy to justify unethical things, right? And things that get you to where you don't want to go. So using it as a cop-out, right, to justify whatever you do. Well, whatever we do it to God's glory. It can't be a standalone justification, right? And we know we have to think bigger than that in terms of how it is really serving. So principle 2, develop and keep. There's actually been a number of others at this conference that have written about this sort of an idea. But just the understanding that what we're doing in engineering is using the creation that God has entrusted to us. And we're so stuck in this developing versus keeping, right? And the designing, building versus creation care, right? But it really, the biblical picture is that it's all one, right? And it's hard to think like that because we always find ourselves in these ethical dilemmas where I'm getting ahead of myself, but in our finitude, we feel like we're putting one versus the other, right? And I think really holistically, we shouldn't, but we have to because that's what we're limited with, right? With the framework, our human framework that we work in. But certainly, this is one of the best motivations to deepen our understanding of what we do and to want to do it with excellence, but also very much recognize that we're using God's resources and to always be thinking sustainably. And actually, this is one of those interesting things where the professional ethical codes are catching up to us in this a little bit, right? We're starting to see a little bit of sustainability and things like that showing up, but there's plenty of ways to go, right? I think all of us too kind of sense how it's sort of just a buzzword, right? Oh, you say it's sustainable. Well, great, it's sustainable, but then there's a lot more to it than that. So related to that, actually, I'd certainly say one of the negatives is it's really easy then to try to use this in an isolated way to say whatever we want to do is fine, right? God gave it there. God gave it to us to ravage it, right? To do it where we want. The creaturely infinite piece, very valuable for interpersonal relationships, and I would say probably in our conversation that we had, this is where we spent a lot of our time, and I really appreciated the feedback from all the different industries and how this plays out. I don't have time to go through the quotes for sure, but some really good reflections on how being creaturely and finite, and that's sort of we actually heard a little bit earlier today that finitude is something different than sinfulness. And both of them are a part of that, right? I mean, we make sinful decisions and make mistakes. We actually try to make good decisions that end up being pretty big mistakes too, right? And both of those are that it gives you that humble posture that you need, right? And when you make decisions to think of this, and in a very practical way, the entire industry profession knows this in terms of doing factors of safety, right? So I love to teach things like that in class. And say, see, everybody knows they're creaturely. They just don't quite have the understanding for why it is. And so look for those quotes. And by the way, those of you who came in later, I should mention the proceedings are all posted on if you go to the christianengineering.org webpage and go to the 2019 conference, then this paper and the other papers are all there. So you feel free to go reference them if you haven't seen them yet. But some of the highlights, this idea of image bearing came up very much in terms of the especially in the building industry and when you're working with contractors, right? You're an engineer and the contractor, or the engineer and the architect, and whatever this sort of the designer and the engineer, and all these different relationships. Just a reminder that as a person is made in the image of God. I may totally disagree with them, right? And they may be way off the wall, but they're made in the image of God. I need to show them respect. And that was striking to me because that was not one that I had thought hard of in these principles before. I very much appreciated that reflection. being mindful of our own humanness and treating others with the grace that God has shown to us. So I think all three of those were actually kind of direct quotes that came from those in the room here, the writing part of it. And I think the idea of limited design too, recognizing that we are creaturely, we're not the saviors. Right? Our design is not going to save the world. That's not the scope that God has given us, but God has very much called us to be responsible. Only got a couple minutes left. So bearing God's image, I love that. That was a really good takeaway that came out of that. Alleviating suffering. This has been one that we talked about a little bit. The original wording of the principle talked about human versus non-human. That was always a little bit of a challenging, and actually I think that even for the folks here, they didn't quite pick up on that piece of it like I sometimes hope students would. So I wanted to think about, and the students haven't either, right? It's not worded as good as it could be maybe. So I wanted to think a little bit about how to get at what we were trying to get at, because we were really trying to address originally, we recognize that we're in a fallen world. We do have a responsibility as engineers to meet needs, right, as the hands and feet of Christ. But something about the wording was a little bit tricky, so I wrote a little bit about that in the paper. And then the already and not yet, the idea that we are not in the new heavens and earth yet, right? But we profess to be in living in the area after Christ's sacrifice, right, for us, and this sort of gives us a good posture. I think principles 1 and 5 are more posture. 2, 3, and 4 give you a more specific carefulness and thoughtfulness in the decision. So I have to wrap up, but I'll just say, if you look in the paper, I tried to reword the principles a little bit based on their feedback, and I think I'm going to use this with students a little bit more going forward. And I added image bearers as a separate one, because actually I thought that was something unique from being creaturely and really valuable in interpersonal relationships in terms of how the world that all of us live and work in. And I tried to start playing with number 5, which used to be the number 4, and I'll probably keep playing with that one, and just to kind of decide if it's really accomplishing what I want. And in some ways, 5 is what we all know as engineers, right? We're problem solvers. And that is a biblical concept, I think, right? And we didn't want to lose that, but it's sort of how we solve those problems and what our posture is. So, all right, I'll just flip through that. And I probably didn't really leave myself time for questions, but
Would you switch back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
So both of us will have questions to read these.
Yeah.
Any questions for Justin?
You're referring to a paper, or do we have that?
No, that's what I mentioned. So if you go online now, it's posted on the ChristianEngineering.org website. So, and that the other papers that are part of the conference these are presentations of longer papers. So, and they're publicly available. So feel free to ask for them.
Yep. Just give me an idea if maybe the one about you strike through like human and non-human.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the lack of response on that, could that be to how to process a potential conflict between the human needs, or needs of humans, and needs of non-human aspects of creation?
Yeah. I think that is part of it, right? Because it's actually really hard to have a consistent metric between what a human need is and what a non-human sort of need is.
Hold on to that thought.
Yeah. So that's, and actually we did that on purpose. So that's why Jeremy's paper is coming up and thinking about that a little bit. Good. Well, should we just transition there then? Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, the down dances.
Yeah, I don't know. Where's the laser?
The yellow.
My co-author, Matthew Kuhn couldn't be here for a variety of scheduling reasons, although he wanted to come. And you may hear me refer to Matt at some point during this talk. Really as a group effort, and that's what I'm talking about. Let me give you a little background on where this talk comes from and my motivation for thinking about these ideas. I heard a few months ago a very prolific, very well-respected author say that he writes books to work through problems. And this is kind of what I'm doing. I'm not either well-known or prolific, but when I have something that I'm trying to work through, then I'll try to give a talk on it, write a paper on it. For several years at Calvin University, we've had an engineering sustainability designation. So if the students do these 4 things, they get a little thing on their transcript. And I've never actually seen a student transcript, so I don't know what the thing is, but it appears to be motivating. So we've got 2 1-credit seminar classes, an intro class, and these are kind of meant to be bookends. The intro class is on sustainability challenges, and then the final class is a sustainability analysis class that Matt teaches. The students have to take a sustainability elective, which can be either 3 or 4 credits. For those of you that are looking this way, all the color is over here. If you picked that up yet. And then the 4th thing is that they have to do a sustainability practicum, which can be a senior design project, a research, or internship experience. Matt and I teach the sustainability challenges class in rotation. So I've taught that class now 3 times. And after my most recent experience, I've got the students for 1 hour a week for a semester. And I thought there's got to be a better way to teach this class. What I want to do is get student engagement and discussion, and instead I'm lecturing them. And so I pitched to Matt last January the idea of writing a new book for the class where each chapter is about 10 pages that gives kind of basic information that a student would need to get up to speed in order to have a discussion. So let me put the facts at your fingertips. You take an online quiz that's your ticket into the class discussion, and now at the end of the chapter there will be 8 to 10 discussion questions that we can spend class time discussing. And so we're spending this summer writing that book. It should go live early next year if you're interested in having a copy. Our publisher is Morgan & Claypool, and they primarily deal in electronic texts. So something like 70 to 80% of engineering students can check this book out of their library electronically. So they don't even have to buy the book. And here's our class outline. We talk about population, economics, energy, air, water, plants, animals, food and agriculture, and a variety of other topics. The paper at least started out as a draft of chapter 13. So the worldview chapter was going to be an optional part of the book, but and it maybe didn't quite go the way we wanted it to go. So I maybe still have to write a chapter 13. So when talking about sustainability, I've got some graphics here about what sustainability means. The 3 pillars of sustainability are usually thought of as environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. So the sort of social justice, economic profit, or economic profitability, and environmentalism. This is pretty limited. So in our class we talk about sources and sinks. Where are we getting things from, and where do we put things? So extracting raw materials from the environment, discharging pollution, for instance. the sort of governing equation, at least at this introductory level that we're working on, is called the IPAT equation. So the human impact on the environment, that's I, is equal to the product of human population times human affluence, which is essentially economic consumption per person, times technology, which is the environmental impact per unit of consumption. And so this is an identity. The units are sort of true by definition, but it's a helpful guiding principle to see what the different aspects of sustainability are. When you're talking about sustainability, you have to say of what? And probably the most famous definition is the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think that that is too limited because it's solely focused on humanity, and we need to bring in the non-human creation to that. The second question is how long? One of the textbooks that we used early on in this course said 50 years is a reasonable time frame for human cognition. That's kind of a human lifespan. That's what we can deal with. 100 years is too long, right? Nobody cares about 100 years. But I think if you think about what the word sustainability means, it means indefinitely. So when I think about sustainability in this context of the course that I'm teaching, we're talking about human and non-human creation forever. And so with those definitions in mind, it's clear, to me at least, that we're having a sustainability crisis, and moreover that sustainability is the most important challenge of our time, and engineers are well equipped and responsible for considering these things and working on these things. Sustainability is challenging because sustainability problems are complex, interconnected, multifaceted. So when you talk about food, that involves energy and transportation and land use and air and water and oil and our built environment and plants and animals, and it all gets wrapped together with social policy and government regulations. My colleague Matt says you can never ever change just one thing. There are always rippling consequences. The time scales in a variety of ways, and I don't have time, pardon if I'm going into this right now. The time scales involved in sustainability aren't suited for kind of human cognition and human abilities. In some sense, if we think about what the end might look like, it's going to come all of a sudden. We don't have the time to turn the train around. On the other hand, sustainability is an infinitely long problem, and we care about 50 years, maybe 100 years. Sustainability involves trade-offs that are difficult to decide, in part because they are denominated some in dollars, some in things that you could convert to dollars, and some in things that just don't have a dollar value. And what I want to focus on today is whether or not we have a guiding framework. My primary objective for this time is to have you do some beta testing of the end of chapter questions. And I've got 6 here. I'm going to go to the 7th on the board. And we're going to pass around some paper. I'd like everybody to get a half sheet, and we're going to look at these sustainability questions. And one of the things I want you to think about as you're answering the questions are, what are the trade-offs embodied in the question? So these are questions that do not, and in some sense, cannot have a right answer because they depend on your values. I'm going to come back to this. You don't have to read them right now. So the paper spends a fair bit of time arguing that traditional academic disciplines, what we might call science, can't provide us guidance on questions of values and sustainability. Many times, what you're sustaining depends on what you value. And our theology also doesn't give us good guidance on trade-offs. And so while we have there's a lot that has been written on the theology of sustainability, it has not led to sustainable action or a sustainable society. And so this is kind of the central, I think, problem of the worldview chapter. What worldview do we need, or what theology do we need that would help us to make society more sustainable? And I think the paper offers the notion of corporate sin and corporate repentance as a guiding and motivating framework for making corporate decisions that will be more sustainable. And so the second objective is to invite you all to participate in the ongoing work of a theology of sustainability, either, if you think I'm wrong, it's an easy thought for next time. If you want to collaborate, let me know. One of the things that Matt and I are talking about is a possible summer working group. CCCS is the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship, which supports some of that interdisciplinary and collaborative work sometimes. So I'd like each of the tables to take one of the questions, and I'm going to randomly assign them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. And maybe you folks on the wall can do a 5. Okay? So I'll give you your questions in just a moment. Write down 2 answers. Again, they don't have to be right, just write them down. Think about what are the trade-offs involved in those answers, what is the dominant value involved in those answers, and then what I want you to put maybe on, you can draw a line and then put on half of the paper. The feedback that I want is what's unclear about the question, what more information do you need, and can you suggest some improvements for the question? Okay. So question 1 is, what should the world population be? How do we achieve it, and what should the distribution of that population be? Can we move people around from one place to another place? What rights do future generations have? For instance, should we demolish historic structures that are energy inefficient? Does posterity have a right to the history embodied in that structure, or should we live for an energy efficient now? What rights do the non-human creation have? Can we dam a river to generate electricity and control water for human benefit? Should a subsistence farmer convert rainforest to cropland to increase his family's standard of living, or should we conserve an environmentally important resource? So, there the idea of stewardship versus mercy. Are the environmental benefits of banning air travel worth the social cost? Should we draw down the underground aquifer to grow crops for biofuel, or should we conserve water to feed future generations? And then number 7, should we legislate thermostat set points? Should it be illegal to set the air conditioning below 80 or the heat above 68? You can make that law. Nothing says we couldn't do that. What would the implications of such a law be? All right. So those are the questions. Again, what's unclear, some more information needed, and suggestions for this question.
you're told we're number 5.
You can do 4 of those.
That's kind of interesting.
Right. Do one number 5.
They're, I mean, almost all of them. Get that and figure out a good one.
What does he mean though by aesthetics for travel? Like, how's that environmental benefit?
So again, what I'm most interested in is the feedback on the bottom half of the slide. What's unclear? Is more information needed for your question? Suggest improvements to the question. So as you think about trying to answer the question, I don't actually care about the answer. I mean, I care about the answer, but this is an academic exercise. As you think about trying to answer, give me the feedback. Is it unclear? Do you need more information? Suggest improvements to the question. The questions again are right here.
Do you want this as a group discussion or individual response?
So you can, group discussion is great, but individual response.
I think that number 4 is clear. Are we doing 4? I think 4 is much clearer. And if you can use it in visual scenario. The dilemma. So I'd say unclear, no, more information, travel that, and
Well, I guess the only versus mercy. I'm not. Is that the right word? Almost straight up global stewardship.
yeah. Okay. So that can take a What was your suggestion?
Global stewardship versus
yeah.
It's certainly one possible answer is
And it is global.
for our benefit.
It's more than just a privilege to take care of your family.
Yeah, individual, I mean, that's right.
Yeah, but the right might just be, well, I have the right to trash the environment.
No, I agree.
So you all seem to be happily working, and of course, as a teacher, I loathe to interrupt that. If you're happy working, please, by all means, keep working on these questions. But we are at the time for the break. So I would appreciate it if you would use your break for questions. You guys stay here and I'll go on coffee. Justin, at 3:35, we've got another session in here.
3:30. Yeah, the next session is at 3:30. So.
I want the pieces of paper back. Yep. So we can make maybe a couple of piles, one up front here and one by each door.
For those of you who are doing 2 PDHs, or so you're leaving after this session, I have your certificate if you want. Those that are staying for 3 will have that after that session, and 5, and so forth. So if you're leaving, just swing by and grab your certificate if you signed up. Okay? Continue on the question. Take your break.
We had 3 on earlier. Just one's on now.
looking to try it before the, I will, and I'd also like to.
Okay, what are you gonna use? Are you gonna post it?
Only if you want to.
So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna post it as take out images that I know have rights to.
Exactly. So if we want to do that, that's great. It's just share the
There's some hidden slides in there. I don't want to.
Yeah, I get it. You know, that's what I was gonna basically have these the conference in order to get Oh, okay. So we're okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I was not paying attention to the weather at all. Yeah, because I was actually thinking it was just supposed to be a hot, humid day today. I mean, that's all right, you can feel free to take a break if you like. Obviously, whatever you can do for Jeremy is great, and these are really challenging questions and thoughts to deal with. But feel free to bring your papers up here when you're done, and feel free to enjoy some coffee and other snacks out in the hallway as well. And and those of you who are planning in just the 2 hours, we made it. So you can keep them as your certificates right there. So feel free to grab them. Let me just say thanks to everybody for being here, though. So we're really excited with this turnout. So hopefully it's for all of you. Yeah, that's the issue. We actually talked to the Iowa section, ASC section, how they counted hours and what the rules that were, how they, because